She was still conscious when I looked into her eyes and saw something I hadn't expected. Not panic, not fear, but relief. As if she had finally been heard. Then the monitor flatlined. I had spent 30 minutes treating a label instead of a human being. And now I had maybe for minutes to undo that mistake before it became permanent. Back to the moment she walked through those doors. Her name was Maya Calloway. 29 years old, elementary school teacher, liked hiking on weekends and, according to her file, had been living with a panic disorder diagnosis since she was 19. That detail, those 3 words, typed in faded font at the top of her chart, would quietly shape every decision made in that room for the next 30 minutes. She walked in on her own 2 feet, which already worked against her in a place where the sickest people tend to arrive horizontal. The Earth that night was operating at the kind of controlled chaos that looks like order from the outside but feels like walking a tightrope from the inside. We were short 2 nurses. The waiting room had been at capacity since 6 in the evening, and the fluorescent light above Bayfor had been flickering for 3 days in a way that made everyone in that corner of the department feel slightly unhinged. Maya was assigned to Bayfor. She sat on the edge of the gurney with both hands pressed flat against her sternum, fingers spread wide, as if she were physically trying to hold something in place beneath her ribs. I remember the way she looked when I pulled the curtain back. Not the wild-eyed desperation of someone in the middle of a full panic attack, but something quieter and more unsettling. Her lips had a faint blue tint that I registered somewhere in the back of my mind and then, to my shame, filed away too quickly. She told me she had been feeling a tightness in her chest since that morning, a shortness of breath that came and went, and that her left leg had been aching for 2 days. She said it calmly, clearly, like someone who had rehearsed the words, because she knew from experience that she would have to fight to be believed. I asked her about her panic disorder. I asked when her last episode had been. I asked if she had been under unusual stress lately. She answered each question patiently, and then she said something that I have replayed in my mind every single day since. I know what my panic attacks feel like, doctor. This is different. I nodded. I wrote something in the chart. I told her we would monitor her and that I would be back to check on her shortly. What I did not do, what I should have done in the first 60 seconds, was order a scan to rule out a clot in her lungs. She thanked me. That was the part that stayed with me longest in the weeks that followed. She thanked me, even then, and I walked away carrying the full weight of a bias I didn't even know I was holding. 20 minutes into observation, it was Nurse Sandra Okafor who came to find me. Sandra had been working nights in that for 11 years, and she had the kind of instincts that don't come from textbooks. They come from standing at the bedside of thousands of people at the worst moments of their lives. She didn't page me. She walked directly to where I was standing at the medication station, put a hand lightly on my forearm, and said, very quietly, Dr. Harris, Bayfor. You need to come now. There was no alarm in her voice. There didn't need to be. Sandra only spoke that quietly when things were very, very wrong. When I pushed through the curtain, Maya was no longer sitting upright. She had slumped sideways against the raised rail of the gurney, one arm dangling over the edge, and the rhythm on her monitor had become the kind of irregular that makes your stomach drop before your brain has even had time to process what you're seeing. Her breathing was labored in a way that went far beyond anxiety, shallow, rapid, desperate, like someone trying to breathe through a wet cloth pressed over their face. The oxygen sensor on her finger was reading numbers that should have triggered an alarm 20 minutes earlier. And I remember staring at it for exactly 1 second, thinking about how that flickering overhead light had been bothering everyone on shift. I called for a crash team. The words came out of me automatically, trained reflex. 25 years of emergencies distilled into a single clear command. But inside there was a cold, spreading recognition of what was happening and, worse, of what had been happening all along, her leg pain, her bluish lips. Her calm, precise description of a sensation she had explicitly told me was unlike any panic attack she had ever had. The evidence had been there, arranged in front of me like a completed puzzle, and I had looked at the box, seen the word anxiety printed on the label, and walked away without turning over a single piece. Sandra was already cutting through Maya's sleeve to get a better line in place, moving with the focused economy of someone who does not waste a single motion under pressure. Two residents followed by Dr. James Whitfield from cardiology, who happened to be finishing a consult to Bayes over and heard me call the code. He took one look at Maya and then one look at me, and in his expression I read something I deserve to read, not judgment, exactly, but the sober recognition that we had arrived late to a fight that had been going on for hours. Maya's eyes were still open. She was still present, still fighting, still there, but barely. And in the few seconds before the controlled storm of the resuscitation fully took over, she turned her head toward me, just slightly. And I will never know for certain what she meant by that look. I only know what it cost me. There is a concept in medicine called anchoring bias, the tendency to lock onto the first piece of information. You receive about a patient and filter everything else through that lens. We learn about it in medical school. We discuss it in case reviews. We nod solemnly at conferences where someone presents a cautionary tale very much like this one. And then we go back to the floor, exhausted and overloaded. And we do it anyway, because the human brain is not a diagnostic algorithm. It is a pattern recognition machine that is desperate for shortcuts. And in an emergency department running at 140% capacity, shortcuts feel less like laziness and more like survival. That is not an excuse. It is a confession. The real dilemma of that night was not medical. The medical problem had a solution. It was late, and it was costly, but it existed. The real dilemma was ethical, and it lived entirely inside my chest. Because at some point in the middle of the resuscitation, with Dr. Whitfield working beside me and Sandra managing the room with the precision of an air traffic controller, I had to hold two things simultaneously in my mind: the complete clinical focus required to stabilize Maya Calloway, and the full, clear-eyed acknowledgement that I had heard her tell me something was wrong, that I had all the information I needed to act earlier, and that I had chosen unconsciously, automatically, but undeniably not to act. The word anxiety had done all the work of a locked door. What made it harder, what made it a dilemma rather than simply a failure, was that I was not the only one. Every clinician who had seen Maya over the past 3 years had done some version of the same thing. The note in her chart from her primary care physician, the urgent care visit 8 months earlier, where she was sent home with a prescription for a mild sedative. The therapist who was excellent, truly excellent, but who had no reason to suspect that what Maya was experiencing in her body was not always what she was experiencing in her mind. The psychiatric label had traveled ahead of her like a reputation, and in every waiting room, every exam room, every curtain bay, it had arrived before she did. Dr. Whitfield asked me, without looking up from what he was doing, whether imaging had been ordered on arrival. I said no. He didn't respond immediately. The silence between us lasted approximately for seconds and contained, in my estimation, about 10 years worth of professional reckoning. Then he said, flatly, "Let's fix it now." And that was all. That was the entire conversation. But I heard everything he didn't say, and I knew I would be hearing it for a long time. Sandra caught my eye from across the gurney and held my gaze for just a moment, not accusatory, not forgiving either, just present, the way only people who have been doing this long enough to understand the full complexity of human error can be present. She handed me what I needed before I asked for it. That's the thing about the best nurses. they don't just save the patient. Sometimes, quietly, they save you too. The scan confirmed what Maya's body had been trying to tell us for hours. A large clot had lodged in the main artery carrying blood to her lungs, cutting off oxygen with the slow, methodical efficiency of a door being closed from the inside. It was the kind of finding that, caught early, is treated and resolved, and the patient goes home within a week. Caught at the point we were at now, it was a race between medicine and time had a 30-minute head start. Dr. Whitfield announced the result without inflection, the way experienced physicians do when they need the room to stay steady. But I saw his jaw tighten, and I understood exactly what that tightening meant. We administered a clot-dissolving medication, a treatment that works by breaking down the blockage from the inside, which sounds straightforward until you understand that it also carries the risk of uncontrolled bleeding, and that giving it to someone in Maya's current state was not a decision made lightly. Dr. Whitfield walked me through his reasoning out loud, less for consultation and more, I think, to keep the energy in the room anchored in logic rather than panic. I appreciated that more than I told him. Every second of that conversation felt like watching sand fall through an hourglass that I had already let run too long. Maya's saturation, the measure of how much oxygen was actually reaching her blood, had dropped to a level that placed her in immediate danger of losing consciousness permanently if we did not turn it around in the next few minutes. Sandra was at her head, talking to her in a low, steady voice, telling her to breathe slowly, to stay with us, to keep her eyes open. Maya was trying. You could see it in every line of her face, in the way her hands gripped the rail of the gurney, white-knuckled and trembling, holding on not because she had been told to, but because she had not yet decided to let go. That kind of will is not something you can prescribe. You can only stand beside it and hope you've done enough to deserve it. The medication began to work. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, where the monitor alarm stops and the room exhales and someone says something quietly profound. It was gradual, then incremental, then slow enough that I kept second-guessing what I was reading, watching the numbers climb by single digits, willing them upward with a focus that had nothing clinical about it anymore. Whitfield never left her side. Neither did Sandra. Neither did I. We had entered the part of an emergency that exists beyond protocol and procedure, the part that is purely human, where all you can do is stand at the edge of someone else's life and refuse to step back. At the 42-minute mark, Maya's oxygen level crossed into a range that, for the first time since Sandra had come to find me at the medication station, allowed me to breathe, not to relax, not to feel relieved, just to breathe. The clot had not fully dissolved, and she would need close monitoring and further treatment over the coming hours. But the door that had been closing from the inside had stopped moving. Maya's grip on the gurney rail loosened slightly. She turned her head, found Sandra's face, and said, barely audible, "I told him it was different." Sandra looked at me over Maya's head. I held her gaze. I did not look away. Maya Calloway was transferred to the ICU at 2:17 in the morning. I walked beside her gurney as far as the elevator, which was further than I needed to go, and both of us knew it. She didn't speak during that walk, and neither did I. The corridor was quiet in the way that hospital corridors are only quiet in the hours between midnight and dawn, a specific, pressurized kind of quiet that makes every footstep sound deliberate. When the elevator doors opened, the transport team moved her in smoothly, and just before the doors closed, Maya looked at me one more time. There was no anger in her expression. There wasn't forgiveness either. There was something more complicated than both, something that looked, if I'm being honest, like exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been right about themselves for a very long time without being believed. I stood in that corridor for a few minutes after the elevator closed, not thinking anything coherent, just standing. Sandra found me there on her way back from the supply room. She didn't say anything for a while. She just stood beside me, and that was exactly the right thing to do, and I have never told her that, which is a debt I keep carrying. Eventually, she said, "She's stable. That's what matters right now." And I said, "Is it?" And Sandra, who has been doing this for 11 years and has earned every quiet authority she carries, said, "Tonight it is. Tomorrow you deal with the rest." The formal review began for days later. It was not punitive in the way I had initially feared. It was worse than that. It was thorough. Every decision point was examined. Every notation in the chart was discussed, and the department head, Dr. Renee Caldwell, ran the session with the precise, unsentimental clarity of someone who understood that the goal was not to assign blame but to understand failure deeply enough to prevent it. I spoke honestly. I did not minimize what had happened or construct a version of events that softened my role in it. The team sat with that honesty in a way that was uncomfortable for everyone, which meant it was working. What emerged from the review was not a simple verdict of negligence. It was a structural map of how multiple systems had failed Maya simultaneously. Her anxiety diagnosis, entered by a well-meaning clinician a decade earlier, had never been cross-referenced against her evolving physical symptoms. The intake protocol for the ER had no mandatory checkpoint requiring clinicians to actively challenge a pre-existing psychiatric label before attributing new physical complaints to it. The environment that night, understaffed, overcrowded, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb that no one had fixed, had created exactly the conditions in which cognitive shortcuts thrive and go unchallenged. Maya had not been failed by one person. She had been failed by a system that had quietly normalized the failure. The department implemented 3 new protocols within the following 6 weeks. Maya spent 9 days in the hospital in total and was discharged with a treatment plan and a follow-up schedule that, for the first time in her medical history, treated her as a complete person rather than a diagnosis. I don't know if she ever thought about forgiving me. I know I thought about asking for it, and I know I never did because I understood, somewhere deep and honest in myself, that forgiveness was not what the situation required of me. What it required was change in how I saw, in how I listened, and in how I read the silence between what a patient says and what a chart says about them. I've been doing this for 25 years. I have seen things in this job that change the texture of my sleep permanently. Cases that live in my body rather than my memory, not as images, but as sensations, like the specific weight of a silence after you've lost someone you thought you could save. Maya Calloway's case lives in me differently than most. Not as a wound, exactly. More like a scar that I press on deliberately, sometimes, when I feel myself moving too quickly through a patient encounter. When the waiting room is full and the chart is long and some small voice in the back of my mind reaches for the shortest explanation available. Press on it, reneged mild out. Because here is what I learned that night, and what I want you to understand if you take nothing else from this story. A label is not a diagnosis. It is a starting point, and in medicine, starting points can become ceilings if you let them. When Maya told me that what she was feeling was different, she was not exhibiting anxiety about her anxiety. She was a person with 29 years of experience living in her own body, telling a trained professional something precise and important. And I chose, politely, professionally, with all the best intentions intact, not to hear her. That choice almost cost her everything. It taught me more than any textbook I have ever read. I think about Sandra sometimes, the way she stood beside me in that corridor without saying anything, because she knew that some reckonings have to happen in silence before they can happen in words. I think about Dr. Whitfield, who gave me the grace of 4 direct, quiet seconds instead of a scene, and then got back to work. I think about the people in this profession who hold each other accountable not with punishment but with the harder, longer work of genuine reflection. Medicine is practiced by human beings, and human beings carry biases the way they carry everything else, unconsciously, until something forces them into the light. And I think about Maya, not the Maya of the chart, not the Maya of the diagnosis, but the Maya who pressed both hands flat against her chest in Bayfor and looked at me with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been telling the truth for years without being believed. I think about the fact that she said thank you when I left her, even then. I think about what that cost her to say, and what it should have cost me to hear. And what I am still paying on that debt every single time I pull back a curtain and look, really look, at the person sitting on the other side. That is the only kind of medicine I know how to practice anymore, the slow kind. The kind that listens first. The kind that understands that a human being arriving in your emergency room is never just their worst day. They are every day that came before it, and every day they are still fighting to reach.